So here we have the story of Abraham. Abraham has a child called Ishmael with Hagar, because Abraham was unable to have children with his wife Sarah. Sarah suggested, have a child with Hagar, and they give birth to a child called Ishmael. Then, miraculously, Abraham and Sarah are able to have a child, and they do have a child later called Isaac. Isaac and Ishmael are an interesting study, because they would both be progenitors of nations to come. Ishmael is the father and ancestor of the Arab and later Muslim world. Isaac, the ancestor and father and patriarch of the Jewish world. And the plot thickens, which we'll talk about in coming weeks, because Isaac would have two children, twins, Jacob and Esau, and Esau is the ancestor and father of Rome, of the Western Roman Christian world. So we're focusing on what is this week's chapter that talks about Isaac and Ishmael, but you see how the plot thickens, how it broadens. And when you can understand that they were in conflict, it can help us understand how their children and descendants that ultimately became nations of their own have conflicts, because they did begin with ideological, spiritual conflicts. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. This feud between Ishmael and Isaac, half brothers, both shared a father called Abraham, two different mothers. And you find that Sarah, the mother of Isaac, tells Abraham, Ishmael is a bad influence on Isaac, I want you to send them away. And he does. He doesn't want to, but he sends Ishmael and his mother Hagar away. God protects them, but they were sent away. What was the conflict there? And it doesn't really state it. It just says there was something going on. But when you look into the soul, the spiritual and mystical and esoteric teachings, you discover Abraham had done something revolutionary, pioneering. Abraham introduced the idea that life is not egocentric, but God-centric. In simple English, we're not here just to serve ourselves. We're here to serve others, to serve a higher cause, to experience a higher state of consciousness, and to connect to a higher reality. This was a pioneering and trailblazing approach to life, because it countered everything that was going on in his world. The pagan world focused far more on control and power, materialism, and success on that level. You can say it's not surprising, we still have that conflict, don't we? But Abraham did introduce the father of monotheism, the father of all nations, became the patriarch, became the prophet that all major religions follow. Of course, Judaism first, Christianity and Islam. And even, they say, Buddhism. You have words like Brahmin and other words, many words that seem to associate with a Brahmin as in Abraham. Which isn't surprising, because the Bible does talk about Abraham sending his children with a certain set of beliefs and philosophies to the east. However you turn it, Abraham is a key figure in understanding the future of the world. Because had Abraham introduced the concept, as we're told, of justice, of virtue, of kindness, of compassion, that yes, we forego our own personal comforts and our own self-interest for being virtuous, being kind. That's what Abraham dedicated himself and his family to. So here he has two children, Ishmael and Isaac. Seemingly all's good. They're both following Abraham's path. It should lead to only harmony and beautiful peace. And yet it wasn't so simple, because Abraham did live in a time of tensions. What that means is the material world was not ready to just surrender to spirituality and to higher consciousness. Maybe they would if it was on their terms, back to control. How do you deal with a world, a material world that's hostile to spiritual, ethereal, and refined values? So there are three ways. You can ignore it, which obviously is just avoiding the issue. You can go to war with it, or you learn to transform that world. I should say there's another path, a path of asceticism, which is not just avoidance, but finding a life on a mountain where you avoid the challenge. But it's still a form of avoidance, but it is a path. It's a path of asceticism. Isaac I should go with Ishmael and Isaac. Both chose different paths. Ishmael was the warrior. He was a much more stronger path, and because of his religious passion, actually, you see, Ishmael actually comes from the word Yishmael, God should listen. Because Ishmael was a man of prayer, as his mother was. They prayed. And the fervor of passion and religion saw the world around them as a conflict, and therefore went with a far more, a very aggressive approach. That's why it says Ishmael, it says, Yodeh bakol v'yad kol boy, his hand is everywhere and everything within him. A type of no boundaries. Now, I should say war is not really the right word, because that really is reserved for his son-in-law. Later we learn about Esau as the warrior. But Ishmael also inherited from Abraham a type of love, a deep love. But love needs to be disciplined. And for Ishmael, the boundaries were not there. And therefore, there was a confusion between the spiritual values and how do you actually integrate them into the world around you. Isaac was a man of discipline, was a man of, in the Kabbalistic terminology, gevura. Ishmael, chesed. So chesed is a lot of love, but a love also that when you're dealing with a conflict, what can you do? You need to oppose it. Yitzchak was initially a disciplined person with boundaries. So his approach was far more based on boundaries. You have to create boundaries between the material and the spiritual. Ultimately, that too has its challenges because there's still not full integration. But Ishmael and his half-brother Isaac each had different approaches, and therefore in their personal lives there was also a conflict. The conflict between chesed and gvura. Abraham's chesed was a chesed that was a very humble chesed. Ishmael's chesed and love was a very aggressive chesed. And whereas Isaac was far more disciplined. In our own lives, what do you do when you have this challenge? Let's say your child comes home from school and did something wrong. You can go with an approach that basically ignores it, or just you pour on love, but without boundaries, and therefore you can create a spoiled child. Love is beautiful, but it has to have boundaries. You can take the other approach, discipline. Isaac's approach. Discipline also needs to be boundaried, because too much discipline without love won't work as well. And these two conflict with each other when you don't have the proper balance. And hence, they could not get along with each other. Fast forward, turn the clock forward, this would evolve into two nations that have a very different approach to life. Isaac, the disciplinarian, and Ishmael, the giver without boundaries. And that would lead to ultimately two different approaches that do not get along with each other. The boundaries are critical because without boundaries you don't have structure. And without structure, you really cannot integrate anything. When it comes to this battle between living a spiritual life, a life of values, in the material world, if you just go without any boundaries, it becomes a totally confusion. If you go with an approach that has boundaries, you are at least laying the ground for some type of balance. When you see what happened in the last century, and especially in the last few decades, religious wars, which were once the domain not of the Muslims actually, it was the domain of the Christians actually, and others that fought religious wars. What do you see? It's about the name of God. The only way to bring God to this world is to eliminate the opposition. So you say, how is that consistent with love? Well, that's like a flood. It's a love that doesn't have disciplines. So the only way is either you love completely or you destroy that which you cannot control. Isaac's approach is one of discipline. Discipline means, yes, we need to look at those that are different than us, but understand that things take a process until you finally create a type of peace and harmony. The ultimate peace and harmony would happen in the next generation with Jacob. But at this stage of the game, you have these two forces, chesed and gvura. Now, the truth is each of them has a virtue the other does not have. This is not about one winning and the other losing. It's about finding the proper balance. So when you look at events through history, you look at the conflicts of being either too permissive or too restrictive. That's where all the battles take place. You need the balance between the two. In our personal lives, we all have a Ishmael and an Isaac within us. We have the giving love that sometimes needs to have controls and be seasoned and be tempered. And we have the disciplinarian within us. You really need both to be a healthy human being. So when you're faced with a situation that is hostile to your belief system, do you go with aggression? Do you go with total permissiveness? Everything goes? Or do you have some discipline? And of course, that is not an easy thing. It's easier said than done, because the fact of the matter is that when you get down to it, it's hard. How do you really balance the two? How do you teach your child what you did was inappropriate, but you also don't demoralize your child? Discipline needs to be measured as well. But there you have two so-called archetypes, and essentially two personality types that allow us to look at ourselves and look at history, and you'll see this conflict play itself out many, many times. What we ultimately need is a synthesis of the two. And that will come in the next generation, when Esav and Jacob will confront each other, where there you'll have the confrontation of total aggression and war, without the chesed, and Jacob the balance, the harmony, and the beauty that brings together the love and the discipline. But in this stage where we are right now, it's about looking at two features, two qualities, two archetypal resources, or you can say emotional faculties that each of us has. And one is the giving, but you need to know when to stop giving. And discipline, and knowing when discipline also needs to be controlled. And both of them, when they faced head on without that balance, will be a conflict. And that conflict plays itself out throughout history and in our personal lives. This is, in a nutshell, a bit of this family feud and how its implications as it developed throughout history. As we continue this story, you'll see how this all comes to life in so many different ways in our own times. As I said, both on a microcosm and a macrocosm, on a personal level and on a cosmic level. And the key is obviously to get to the root. Once you know the root, what can we do to temper the unbridled love of Ishmael, and to as well use a healthy form of discipline and bring the two together, that these two brothers can live side by side, which ultimately does happen. Later on, Ishmael does reconcile with Isaac in the latter part of their lives. So, my friends, let us all look at these two forces within us and try to find ways to balance it within ourselves. And when we do that on a microcosmic level, it has a ripple effect that can allow it also to spread and express itself in the larger world, the butterfly effect. Thank you so much. This is Simon Jacobson, Meaningful Live, every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, but it's recorded, and you can look up into the archives on all the different platforms and channels. Please share your thoughts, your feedback, your comments, as well as any questions you may have. Share with friends, share with others. It's always an honor and pleasure to speak to you. Simon Jacobson here. Everyone be well, be healthy. Balance that chesed and gvura, that love and discipline within yourself. Thank you.